Hello, I'm Sean, and this is Stories of Mormon. In these videos, I hope to use the Book of Mormon as a guide for understanding current events in the world today. But first, I do want to back up and introduce kind of the theological and philosophical background I'm coming from. So, 10 years ago, I was introduced to Richard Rohr and a lot of his work. And one of the biggest things that stands out to me about what I learned in listening to him teach was about contemplative thinking, and that is getting out of just either or, is this good, is this bad thinking, and finding a way to just kind of accept information and eventually integrate it and eventually try to fit it all together instead of making snap judgments. So, in that context, then about 6 years ago, I was introduced to the work of Jordan Peterson. And Peterson has some really interesting things that he does. He has his biblical series and his maps of meaning and his various other lectures that are many and varied. And after being introduced to Peterson, I then was introduced actually through the video, The Four Horsemen of Meaning. I was also introduced to Jonathan Pageau. And both Peterson and Pageau are major contributors to what I would call my symbolic literacy. So my ability to identify symbols and patterns and really just make sense of them. And I'm just going to tell you now, I talk a big game, but I am not sure that I could hold a candle to what they can see. But their contributions to the things that I have learned have allowed me to see more things than I did before. So even if it's just a little bit more, it has been quite enlightening. But in the context of paying attention to what Peterson is up to and paying attention to Pageau's work, in the last year, I've actually also been introduced to the work of Paul Vanderklay and a number of the people in what they call this little corner. And it's interesting. A part of me really wants to participate in that, but I also understand that the background I'm coming from may not be entirely welcome. So, what's most interesting to me is Vanderklay is, I believe he refers to himself as a Calvinist. There's quite a number of evangelical folk in this little corner. And I think there are a lot of interesting things going on there. And I would dare say that most Mormons are missing out on something. We've congratulated ourselves on how much of the gospel we've got. I think we might be accidentally blinding ourselves to the gospel that other people have as well. And so, as I'm searching and sifting, trying to cobble together what feels like a more whole view than what our correlation committee gave us, I'm finding interesting things out there. So, with that said, I find the approach that I see in Peterson and Pageau and Vanderklay and this little corner all to be very interesting. And for years, I have wished to see analysis similar to Peterson's biblical series on Genesis and also the Exodus series, but done discussing the stories of the Book of Mormon. And, that there's a pattern there for how to discuss these things and how to pull them apart. And I just really wish that somebody would do it with the Book of Mormon. Now, in the context of this, I believe I've already made mention of the meaning crisis, and I hear people talk about the meaning crisis, and it's entirely possible that you may or may not agree that there's a meaning crisis, but there certainly do appear to be shenanigans afoot in the world today. And what I am seeing is that there is a movement of the Spirit of God through people of all Christian traditions. And while I do see the signs of priestcraft as warned about in the Book of Mormon and wolves in sheep's clothing, I know that there are many who are seeking the Lord and are finding communion with His Spirit. So many people focus on arguing about whether the Book of Mormon should be taken seriously, whether it's true. There's a lot of argument about where it happened. I'll eventually offer some opinions on that, but they really are just opinions. And much of that is not entirely relevant to whether or not, some of that is not entirely relevant to what we can learn from the stories in the Book of Mormon about human nature. And what I want to do here is I want to talk about these stories and do so in a way that isn't just me trying to get you to join my church. I feel like it's important to give people space about that and not just make everything about, hey, so you kind of noticed something interesting here. Why don't you come join my church? Like I'm not trying to do that, but also part of that is, well, there's a story there, and we're going to cover it eventually. For those who want to read ahead, it's in Alma 4. For those that don't want to read ahead, well, I'll try to get to that video soon. Anyway, the stories of the Book of Mormon have thoroughly shaped my understanding of human nature. And they provide models for me to understand and make sense of the world around me today. My hope is that I'll be able to pick stories to discuss and present them in ways that invite discussion from all of my Catholic, Orthodox, and evangelical brothers and sisters. I take very seriously the idea that all of us Christians will need to be reconciled together before Christ is able to really come. And I think all of us have some amount of pride that we need to overcome in order for this to happen. And so I'm not going to push everyone to join my church. Well, for reasons I don't want to get into in a public video, because I really don't need a talking to for my stake presidency. Anyway. Now, I'm aware that there are some that simply won't accept what I'm trying to do here because it's the Book of Mormon. And that's a thing that happens. I'm not so naive as to think that I can just show up with a smiling face and, everyone who has feelings about that is just going to change their mind and be like, oh, no, we can listen to this guy. So, but be that as it may, I am hoping to share stories that are extremely relevant for what's going on in the world today. And so, if you'll bear with me, even if you don't really accept the Book of Mormon, I hope to share something valuable. Now, in my approach to the Book of Mormon can be grouped into a few different sections. There's the first part of the Book of Mormon that is based on the small plates of Nephi, and they primarily contain the narrative of Lehi's family and their escape from Jerusalem, as well as some primary theological treatises mixed with commentary on Isaiah for context. So a lot of that it feels like a lot of exposition, kind of setting up our setting for what's going to happen in the book, because really it kind of is. A lot of what is most relevant today actually waits until the sections where their society has scaled to a size that they are running into the same kinds of problems we run into today. So the sections I would like to start focusing on are mostly in the range of the books from Mosiah through 3rd Nephi. There is a lot of political philosophy to be observed in here, and there's plenty of war. We have a lot of great stories about just, in some cases, even what specifically leads to war and what we should be watching out for when it seems like we're just always getting into one war after another. So another section that I may dig into is actually later in the book, which is the Book of Ether. It is a condensed story that describes how a society rose and then self-destructed. And a lot of it comes down to patterns of oppression, the very same kind of patterns that people very rightfully observe in our society today. So, but the Book of Ether is actually presented in the part of the Book of Mormon where the Nephite society is also declining. And in both cases, both societies wore themselves to death. They are completely destroyed. And in a future video, I will go into more detail on this, but it is in fulfillment of the warnings that are actually found at the beginning of the 2nd book of Nephi. But the thing that will be important for us to dig into is really how we're not special. We're not different from them. We are people who are just as foolish as they were. And destroying ourselves and being swept off is a thing that is an option. Now that's on a macro level. And, there's plenty of game to be played before we get to that point in our society. At least I hope so. But it's a thing to be considered. Now, as I work my way through these stories, I want to point out that these specific stories were selected by prophets and that say that they were shown visions of our day, much like John the Revelator was. And based off of what they saw, they chose the specific stories that got included in the Book of Mormon because they would be most relevant to us. So an interesting thing here is kind of it's almost a departure because, I've heard Jordan Peterson talk about, and also I feel like some of this has also come from Jonathan Peugeot, where the stories that we ended up with in the Bible have kind of come through a lot of repetition and filtering. And there's a lot of relevance that has basically been baked into them because they're the stories that survived well enough to show people the right and wrong way to act. And if they weren't useful, they wouldn't have been, they wouldn't have seemed important enough to preserve. Now, that preservation that happened in the biblical canon, where people selected and curated based off of how good the stories or how well they worked, is extremely different from the relevance of stories that come from people who observed our time and are trying to tell us, hey, this is how things are going to go, or this is how things went in our society. By the way, there's things to be learned from this. When we get talking about the Gadianton robbers, and maybe we'll talk about exactly. Well, we'll see what we talk about with that. There's a lot of ground to cover. But that makes these stories of the Book of Mormon an optimized set of meaningful narratives. So the hope is that you don't have to filter through 1,000 pages to find a few narratives that actually are helpful. It's one story after another of stories that were intentionally gathered together to make it. It's a collection of stories, one story after the other, that were specifically curated to be useful and relevant to us today. And as such, should be able to help us make sense of what's happening in the world around us. So, as I prepare further videos, I hope to do these stories justice. When I see the commentary of others who are trying to make sense of and mediate meaning from the Bible and, apocryphal traditions, I can see that I am really not up to the level that they are at. But I don't see anyone giving the Book of Mormon similar treatment. And I really believe that it's critical for someone to try and do this. I am a professional nerd and not a media personality. But my soul calls out to me that this is a thing that needs doing. So I am going to make my attempt. And I hope that you'll come along with me. I actually hope you'll like and subscribe so that this actually is able to get viewed by more people. There's a lot of meaning to be mined here. It is my hope as I make these videos that for anyone who is seeking the Lord and seeking meaning and looking for a way to participate in His coming, I hope that I can turn people in the direction of the Lord. I really hope that I can get a message out, and I hope that I can do so using the time and energy that I have without this being my job. I still have a day job. I still intend to have a day job. I do not intend for any of this to replace that. I'd like to thank you for taking some time to listen to what I have to say here today. And I am hopeful to get started on kind of a series of videos here that will allow me to kind of hit some of the first stories that come to mind that have helped me make meaning, particularly as it relates to my membership in my church and participating in the struggle and the dance that is trying to fit into a religious community. So if you'll come along with me, please like and subscribe so that we can continue this journey together